Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified, where we try to make sense of some of the big ideas in law. And today we're going to be doing a deep dive into some concepts that are absolutely fundamental to how India is governed.
Yeah, that's right. We're talking about the welfare state, the rule of law, the doctrine of separation of powers, and parliamentary sovereignty. And these aren't just sort of abstract ideas. They really form the framework for how laws are made, how they're interpreted and applied in India.
And for anyone kind of following Indian legal studies, these concepts are really essential. It's almost like having a roadmap, I guess, to help you navigate the complexities of India's legal system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's all about seeing the connections between these kind of grand principles and what they mean in the real world, what the implications are.
So let's start by defining these concepts. Let's make sure that even if someone's completely new to this, they can follow along. So let's start with the welfare state. What's the basic idea here?
So, at its heart, the welfare state is all about the state taking responsibility for the social and economic well being of its citizens. So, it's not just about protecting individual liberties, it's about actively working to ensure a basic standard of living for everyone. And you can think of things like public health care, education, social security programs. These are all kind of hallmarks of a welfare state.
So it's not just sort of a passive protector, it's like an active participant in trying to create a more just and equitable society.
Exactly. And this is reflected in the Indian Constitution, specifically in the directive principles of state policy. And these principles, while not legally enforceable in court, they act as a guide for the government to promote the welfare of its people.
So they're aspirational, but still very powerful.
Mm.
And we see this in real life with, things like government-funded hospitals and schools.
Absolutely. These initiatives are aimed at providing essential services regardless of someone's background or their economic standing.
Okay, let's move on to the rule of law. Now, on the surface, this sounds pretty straightforward, but I'm guessing there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. The rule of law is much more than just having laws in place. It means that everyone, and I mean everyone, is subject to the same law. There are no exceptions, not even for those in positions of power.
So it really levels the playing field, ensuring that the law is applied fairly and impartially. Doesn't matter about your status, your wealth, your connections.
Precisely. And this idea actually has very deep roots. Even in ancient Indian texts like the Upanishads, which predate modern legal systems by centuries, they emphasize the supremacy of law. The concept of dharma, or righteous conduct, was closely linked to this idea of a just and ordered society.
So this respect for the law for a system that applies equally to everyone is really woven into the fabric of Indian thought.
Yeah, it is. And while the specific laws and institutions have evolved over time, that fundamental commitment to the rule of law has remained constant.
Okay, let's unpack the doctrine of separation of powers. This one sounds a bit more complex.
It can be, yeah, but it's a really crucial concept. Essentially, it's about dividing governmental power among different branches to prevent any one entity from becoming too powerful. So we're talking about the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary.
So it's like a system of checks and balances, making sure no one branch can just kind of run roughshod over the others. But why is this so important for, the average person? What happens if one branch becomes too dominant?
Well, think of it this way. If the same group of people create the laws, enforce them, and judge those who break them, there's a huge potential for bias and even tyranny. The separation of powers is meant to safeguard against that.
So it's about protecting individual liberties and ensuring that power is distributed and accountable.
Exactly. And while India's system draws inspiration from, Montesquieu's ideas on the separation of powers, it has its own unique features.
It's not like this rigid wall between branches. There's some overlap and interaction.
Right. A good example is the Indian president, as head of the executive branch, is elected by the legislature. So you see a connection right there.
And what about the judiciary? How are judges appointed and removed in India?
That's another area where we see interaction between branches. Both the executive and legislature play a role, which again points to the system of shared responsibility.
So it's more nuanced than simply saying this branch does this and that branch does that.
Precisely. The Indian system allows for a certain degree of flexibility and collaboration between branches.
Now, lastly, we have parliamentary sovereignty. This one, I think, feels particularly relevant in the Indian context.
Yeah, it is, especially considering the historical context of India's legal system. Parliamentary sovereignty, as it's practiced in the UK, means that Parliament has supreme power. They can make or unmake any law, and there are no real checks on that power.
But that's not how things work in India, right?
That's right. India, with its written constitution, opted for constitutional supremacy. This means that the constitution is the ultimate authority. It sets the framework for governance, and it limits the powers of all branches of government, including parliament.
So even Parliament has to operate within the boundaries set by the Constitution.
Exactly. And this distinction is really fundamental to safeguarding individual rights and making sure that the government doesn't overstep its bounds.
So the Constitution really acts as a safeguard against any potential overreach by any branch, including the legislature.
Precisely. And to ensure that the principles of the Constitution are upheld, India has a system of judicial review.
Meaning,
The Supreme Court has the power to review laws passed by Parliament and determine if they are consistent with the Constitution.
so the Supreme Court acts as a guardian of the Constitution, making sure that the legislature doesn't enact laws that violate, fundamental rights or principles.
Yes. And to really illustrate this, I think we should look at some landmark cases where the judiciary has played a crucial role in upholding this idea of constitutional supremacy.
Now that's what I call a deep dive. Let's jump into those cases. I'm ready to hear how these concepts have played out in real life scenarios.
Let's do it. Okay, so we've laid out these big concepts, but to really see their impact, I think we need to look at how they actually function in the real world.
Exactly. Let's start with the welfare state. We talked about its goals, but how does it actually work in India? What does it look like on the ground?
Well, as we mentioned, the directive principles of state policy and the Constitution guide the government in creating a more just and equitable society, but those principles aren't legally enforceable in court.
Right. So how do they actually translate into concrete actions? How do those aspirations become reality?
That's where government policies and programs come in. They're the tools used to actually put those welfare state ideals into practice.
Okay, so give us some specific examples. What are some programs or initiatives that really demonstrate the welfare state in action?
Well, there are countless examples, but let's focus on a few key areas. Take public health care. India has a network of government-funded hospitals and clinics, and these aim to provide affordable health care to all citizens.
That's critical, especially given the vast, economic disparities in India. It attempts to ensure that even those who can't afford private health care have access to at least basic medical services.
Absolutely. The goal is to try to bridge that gap and provide a basic level of care to everyone, regardless of their financial situation.
And what about education?
Education is another cornerstone of the welfare state. India has a system of government-run schools and colleges, and there are also various scholarship programs all aimed at making education accessible to everyone.
This aligns with the directive principle that calls for free and compulsory education for all children up to the age of 14, right?
Exactly. And while achieving that goal completely is an ongoing challenge, the government has made significant strides through initiatives like the Right to Education Act.
So healthcare and education are two major areas where we see the welfare state in action. What are some other examples?
You can think about Social Security programs like pensions for the elderly or disability benefits. These are designed to provide a safety net for vulnerable sections of society.
Right, and these programs become, increasingly important as India's population ages. The welfare state has to adapt to the changing needs of society to ensure that everyone can live with dignity.
Precisely. It's not a static concept. It has to be responsive to demographic shifts, economic realities, and social challenges.
Now, I imagine it's not all smooth sailing.
Hmm.
What are some of the challenges in actually implementing these programs effectively?
Oh, there are definitely hurdles. Reaching everyone who needs help, managing resources, ensuring efficient implementation, these are all huge undertakings.
I imagine there are always tough decisions to be made about allocating limited resources and prioritizing competing needs.
Absolutely. The welfare state is an ongoing project. It's constantly evolving and grappling with new obstacles.
All right, let's shift gears to the rule of law. We established that it means everyone is subject to the law. But how does that actually play out? How is it upheld in practice?
Well, a key aspect of the rule of law is ensuring access to justice for everyone. It's not just about having laws, it's about making sure people can actually utilize the legal system to seek protection and hold others accountable.
So a law is meaningless if people can't actually use it or enforce it.
Exactly. That's why a robust and accessible judicial system is so vital, but there are challenges, of course.
I can imagine India's judicial system is often criticized for being slow and overburdened.
That's a valid concern, yeah. The sheer volume of cases and complex legal procedures can lead to delays and make it difficult for people to get timely justice.
And this can disproportionately impact those who lack resources or legal expertise.
It can, and that's why ongoing reforms and improvements are so necessary to make sure that the rule of law truly serves everyone, not just a privileged few.
Okay, but beyond the courts, what are some other mechanisms that contribute to upholding the rule of law?
Well, you can think about institutions like the police or regulatory bodies. These entities play a crucial role in enforcing the law and ensuring compliance.
So it's not just about having laws on paper. It's about having effective institutions to implement them and hold people accountable.
Precisely, and holding those institutions themselves accountable for their actions is crucial for upholding the rule of law. Transparency, accountability, checks, and balances are all vital to make sure the system works as intended.
Okay, I'm really starting to see how interconnected all of these concepts are. They each play a role in creating a system of governance that is fair, just, and accountable.
Yeah, they do. They're not isolated principles, but interconnected parts of a larger system. Each one reinforces the others, and when one weakens, the whole structure is at risk.
Let's dive into the separation of powers now. We mentioned earlier that it's not a strict separation in India, but more of a system of checks and balances.
Right. To really understand how this works in practice, we need to look at some specific examples.
Okay, so let's start with the relationship between the legislature and the executive. We know the president is elected by the legislature. How else do these two branches interact and check each other's power?
Well, consider how laws are made. A bill has to be passed by both houses of parliament before it can become law. The executive branch, led by the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, plays a key role in introducing bills and guiding them through Parliament.
So there's an element of collaboration in the legislative process.
Definitely, but there are also checks built into the system. For example, Parliament has the power to scrutinize the executive branch's actions. Through question-hour debates and committees, they can hold the government accountable for its decisions.
And Parliament also controls the budget, right?
Exactly. The executive branch needs Parliament's approval for its budget, which gives Parliament significant leverage to influence government policies.
So there's this dynamic interplay between the legislature and the executive with both collaboration and checks on power. It's designed to prevent any one branch from becoming too dominant.
Precisely. Now, where does the judiciary fit into this system of checks and balances?
Good question. They must have a role to play.
They do, and it's a crucial one. As we discussed earlier, the judiciary has the power of judicial review. That means the Supreme Court can strike down laws passed by Parliament if they violate the Constitution.
That's a powerful check on the legislature's authority.
It ensures that Parliament doesn't overstep its constitutional bounds and that laws are in line with the principles enshrined in the Constitution. But it's important to note that the judiciary itself isn't completely immune from checks.
Okay, so even the guardians need guarding. How does that work?
Well, while the judiciary is independent, the process of judicial appointments and removals involves both the executive and the legislature. This ensures a level of accountability and prevents the judiciary from becoming too isolated from the other branches.
So it's this complex system of checks and balances, with each branch having its own powers and limitations.
It is, and it's constantly evolving as new challenges and interpretations arise. That's what makes studying the Indian legal system so fascinating.
I'm starting to appreciate just how nuanced and dynamic it all is.
It is, and that nuance is essential to ensure that the system works as intended, protecting individual liberties while also allowing for effective governance.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground on the separation of powers. Let's move on to our final concept. This tension between parliamentary sovereignty and constitutional supremacy.
Yeah, this is where things get particularly interesting in the Indian context, given the historical backdrop and the choice India made in its system of governance.
Right, as we discussed, India chose constitutional supremacy over the British model of parliamentary sovereignty. What are the real-world implications of that decision? Why does it matter so much?
Well, think about the historical context. India, after centuries of colonial rule, wanted to establish a system where the rights and freedoms of its citizens were paramount, protected from any potential abuse of power, even by parliament.
So the Constitution was seen as the ultimate safeguard, the bedrock upon which a truly independent and democratic India could be built.
Exactly. The Constitution, with its fundamental rights and directive principles, became the ultimate authority, and the judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court, plays a crucial role in upholding that principle.
So if Parliament passes a law that violates the Constitution, the Supreme Court can step in and declare it invalid.
That's right. And that power of judicial review has been used in numerous landmark cases to protect fundamental rights and ensure that the government operates within constitutional limits.
That's a pretty stark contrast to the idea of parliamentary sovereignty, where parliament has ultimate authority.
It is, but of course, this tension between Parliament and the judiciary hasn't always been smooth sailing. There have been instances where Parliament has pushed back against the judiciary's interpretations of the Constitution.
I imagine there's always a bit of a tug-of-war between these two powerful branches of government.
But ultimately, it's a testament to the strength of India's democracy that this tension is allowed to play out within the bounds of the legal system.
It sounds like an ongoing balancing act,
Yeah.
with each branch trying to assert its authority while also respecting the framework of the Constitution.
Yeah.
That must make for some fascinating legal battles.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what we'll be exploring in our final segment. We'll be diving into some of the most impactful legal cases in Indian history cases that have shaped how these concepts are understood and applied.
That's what I call bringing the theory to life. I'm ready to hear about the dramas, the conflicts, and the landmark decisions that have shaped India's legal landscape.
Let's get into it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of conceptual ground, but now it's time to actually see how these principles play out in the real world. In the courtroom where the rubber meets the road.
Exactly. Legal cases aren't just these abstract arguments. They're stories with real people, real stakes, and lasting consequences. Is how these big concepts translate into, tangible outcomes that affect all of us.
Okay, so let's start with a case that's crucial for understanding this idea of the welfare state. Tell me about Minerva Mills.
So Minerva Mills, decided in 1980, is a real cornerstone of Indian constitutional law. And it grapples with this balance between the directive principles of state policy and fundamental rights.
And for our listeners who might need a refresher, remind us what those are again.
Right. So the directive principles, as we discussed, are these guidelines for the government to create a more just and equitable society. Things like providing healthcare, education, a living wage. They're these aspirational goals that are enshrined in the Constitution.
Right. And while they're important, they're not legally enforceable in court in the same way as fundamental rights, which are those core individual liberties that are laid out in Part 3 of the Constitution.
Exactly. So the question in Minerva Mills was, what happens when a law that's designed to achieve a directive principle clashes with a fundamental right? How do you reconcile those two potentially competing objectives?
That sounds like a real legal dilemma. How did the court resolve it?
Well, the Supreme Court held that both fundamental rights and directive principles are essential for India's democracy. They're not mutually exclusive, they actually complement each other.
So it's not about picking one over the other, it's about finding a balance.
Precisely. The court emphasized that the government should strive to achieve the directive principles, but not at the expense of violating fundamental rights. It's about finding a path to social and economic justice while also protecting individual liberties.
So Minerva Mills really highlights the complexities of the welfare state and how its implementation isn't always, a simple, straightforward process.
It does. It really underscores this constant need for interpretation negotiation, finding the right balance between these competing interests. Now let's shift gears to a case that's absolutely fundamental to understanding the rule of law, and that's the Kesavananda Paradi case.
And you mentioned earlier that this is one of the most significant judgments in Indian constitutional history. What makes it so important?
Well, this is the case that established the basic structure doctrine.
Okay, that rings a bell, but remind us what that means.
Essentially, it means that there are certain fundamental principles underlying the Constitution that cannot be amended even by Parliament.
So even though Parliament has the power to amend the Constitution, there are limits to that power.
Exactly. The Kesavananda Paradi case recognized that certain features of the Constitution are so essential to its identity and integrity that they're off limits even to the legislature.
And this is crucial for upholding the rule of law, right? It prevents the Constitution from being undermined or distorted even by a democratically elected body.
Absolutely. It ensures that the Constitution, as the supreme law of the land, remains the bedrock of the legal system. The Kesavananda Paradi case acts as a safeguard against this idea of tyranny of the majority, ensuring that these fundamental principles of democracy, justice, and individual rights are protected.
It's a powerful example of how the judiciary can act as a guardian of the Constitution, ensuring that other branches of government don't overstep their bounds. Okay, let's move on to a case that illustrates the separation of powers in action, and that's the S.R. Balmai case.
Okay, so S.R. Bommai decided in 1994 dealt with this very controversial issue of president's rule.
And just to clarify for our listeners, president's rule is when the central government takes direct control of a state, usually because of political instability or a breakdown of law and order.
Precisely. And the question in S.R. Bommai was, what are the limits on the central government's power to impose president's rule? Can they just do so arbitrarily?
That's a crucial question, considering the potential for, abuse of power.
It is. And the Supreme Court, in its judgment, laid down some crucial safeguards to prevent such abuse.
So how do they limit the central government's power in this area?
The court held that the imposition of president's rule is not an absolute power. It has to be based on objective criteria and subject to judicial review.
So the central government can't just dismiss a state government on a whim or for political expediency. There has to be a legitimate justification, and the courts can actually scrutinize that justification.
Exactly. And that right there is a clear example of the separation of powers in action. The judiciary, in this case, acted as a check on the executive branch's power, ensuring that it was exercised within constitutional limits.
So S.R. Baumai serves as a reminder that even in these extraordinary situations, the core principles of the Constitution and the separation of powers must be upheld. It's really a testament to the resilience of India's democratic institutions.
Yeah, it really is. And I think what's so fascinating about these cases beyond their specific legal outcomes is that they reveal something deeper about India's journey as a nation.
I agree. They're not just about legal technicalities. They're really stories about, this ongoing struggle to balance power, protect rights, and build a just and equitable society.
Yeah, they capture those tensions and complexities beautifully. Their narratives of conflict, compromise, and the constant evolution of India's constitutional democracy. And they remind us that these concepts, the welfare state, the rule of law, the separation of powers, they aren't these static ideas, but dynamic principles that are constantly being interpreted and reinterpreted in the face of new challenges.
It's a reminder that the law is this living thing that's constantly adapting to new realities and social context. And that's why it's so important to understand these principles, engage with them, and participate in that ongoing dialogue about how they're applied in our society.
Absolutely. It's through these discussions, debates, and yes, even legal battles that India's democracy continues to evolve and mature.
Well said. This has been a fascinating deep dive into some of the key concepts of Indian governance. Hopefully our listeners now have a deeper understanding of these principles and how they shape India's legal and political landscape.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, don't forget to subscribe to LexTalks for more insightful explorations of the world of Indian law.
Keep learning and keep questioning.
Thanks for tuning into LexTalks. Subscribe and keep learning.